I'm sometimes asked, what do we want to see in education in New South Wales? And given we are more than a third of the country, I can almost say Australia. And it does pick up a couple of the things that Ian said. What we certainly don't want to do is just churn out factory workers and people who are going to fill up office towers. We want to graduate people out of school that have got the kinds of skills that Ian was talking about. The kinds of people that businesses like the Commonwealth Bank or the person who comes to fix the plumbing or a future teacher is going to need. And that is knowledge, of course, but it's much more than that. It's about art, it's about drama, it's about imagination, it's creativity, it's all of those kinds of things. So when we do look around the world at some of the highest performing countries, and when we look at the research, some of it is a little two-dimensional when you then try and bring it back to Australia and transpose it here. I don't think we want to have an education system like South Korea, where the pressure is on. Young children are up at 10, 11, 12 o'clock at night doing extra tutorial work just to be able to cope at school. I think we want something a little bit more complicated and a little bit more nuanced than that. So I think that's the broad purpose that the New South Wales Government and myself as the Minister for Education comes to this position with. I was very pleased the other day to see the new Prime Minister say in his press conference where he announced the new cabinet, his emphasis on human capital. And if there is one purpose in education, it is to develop the human capital in this country. And we're seeing changes in our economy with the mining boom and other things. One thing is going to always remain constant in this country, and that is the need to develop our human capital. And obviously the key role that education plays in that. In the 5 years that I've been the Minister for Education, what we've tried to focus our attention on is using evidence to drive the decisions that we make, both at a government level, at a department level, or whether it's the Board of Studies. Using the evidence from around Australia, and Fields Rickard, we met when I was the Shadow Minister for Education, talking about the university training of teachers and the great work that his university is doing in Melbourne, really raising the status of the profession. Looking at Victoria, looking at the other states, looking around the world, looking at what academics, both here and internationally, say what needs to be done in education, and then putting that into practice. And I see one of my roles as a minister, I'm that link between policy, research, and actually putting it into place. Now, whether that's changing legislation, changing policy, both for government schools and across the three sectors here in New South Wales, my role is that critical link between those two things. Knowing what ought to be done and then actually doing it. And I think sometimes we see in New South Wales, or I'd like to say, used to see in New South Wales, and in some jurisdictions, the difficulty making that link. The biggest enemy of education reform and education policy is the press release, because politics by its very nature chases headlines and is often attracted to the shiny little ball, the trendy. Parsi Salzberg refers to it as something, and I'm trying to remember what he calls it, but being the germ, that's right, the germ. Attracted to those things that sound great in a political sense, and parents out there hear that some new fancy name program is going to change the world when we know that it's not. The difficult part of reform is the boring part of reform. Boring for politicians, boring for politics, boring for parents, hard to explain. Explaining to parents about why investing in teacher training doesn't set the world on fire. It's not like standing in front of a new school and cutting a ribbon or handing out 3D printers. It is much more complicated than that. And that's why my role as a minister and as a politician is absolutely critical. And if I'd like to think we've done one thing in 5 years, is we've actually bridged that gap. Of course, we can always do more. But the great thing about evidence for a politician is it's both a sword and a shield for what you do. It is very difficult to be criticised for a decision you make, even if it is unpopular or hard to explain, when you have to say to somebody, here's the evidence for it. If you think it's wrong, you show me better evidence. It is very, very hard to do. So evidence and research and data is both a sword for politicians, but it's also a shield. Principals said to me when I began this, and again, prior to being Minister for Education, when I was the opposition spokesman, was, and this was really at that heated period when the My School website came out, was we're all happy to be accountable for our results and our students' results and our schools' results, but we need to have a lot more influence in the things that determine those results. So one of those obviously is decision making, and within government schools we've freed that up in a way that Catholic and independent schools have probably had freedom, that kind of decision making freedom, for a very long time. But in government schools we've not had that kind of freedom. Now again, this is not the silver bullet, and if the evidence around the world and nationally shows us anything, is that there is no such thing as one silver bullet. It is a combination of multiple factors that work a combination of which work in one school. The same combination don't work in another school. It's a slightly different combination, different contexts. But we know that there's no silver bullet. But principals ask for this. Give us more decision-making power over how we use our resources. Give us more resources. Give us more money. Now, New South Wales and myself personally, we have been the greatest advocate for the Gonski reforms and the funding that came with it ever since David Gonski handed down his report about 3 or 4 years ago. I saw, coming from Western New South Wales, one of the first briefings the department gave me about it was the impact that would have on regional schools. Walgett's, the Brewarrenas, the West Dubbos, Grafton High, Grafton Public. What difference it would make to those schools in terms of the resourcing they got. And they were disproportionate winners out of a needs-based funding system, particularly when you kick in the extra dollars as per the agreement we signed with the Commonwealth. Now, obviously, the extra dollars helps substantially, but what it said to me also was that if you use a needs-based funding model where you fund schools, you provide a base rate and then you fund them based on loadings of Aboriginality, low SES, disabilities, remoteness, location, and that regional schools and some schools in Western Sydney were getting disproportionately more money from that system, meant the current system, or now the previous system of funding, had been underfunding those schools for a very long time. And I'll give you a great example. And I said this in the paper the other day, and I spoke to Minister Birmingham, and I said, please ignore the headline. It wasn't meant to sound like that. But there was a comment that we've spent $40 billion from 2000 to about 2012 in extra money, and it hasn't made any difference. We have spent extra money, but once you factor out inflation, the increases in teacher salaries as per salary agreements and the like, you factor out a couple of other things, including increased student enrolment, increased demand-based funding, increased student enrolments, we spend more money in education. Once you factor out all those things, real per capita funding in education has grown less than the increase in national GDP, So there has not been a substantial increase prior to the Gonski funding starting last year. So I said, if you go to any school, almost any school, certainly any public school in a non-affluent area or a low-fee Catholic or Christian school, and tell me that they've got enough money. Now, an extreme example is at Walgett. I went there one time and went into the kindergarten class, and there in the window was this old evaporative air conditioner, one of those swampy, those evaporative air conditioners, and it had all the slats were all broken and they were rusted and whatever. jammed in this window. You can just picture it. And I said to the teacher, I said, that looks terrible. I said, surely, should have fixed that up. And she said, well, it's worse than that. She said, it's so noisy that we can't switch it on during the day, during class, because the kids can't hear above the noise of the air conditioner. So she said, we turn it on in the morning, and it gets pretty hot in Walgett, as you can imagine. We turn it on in the morning, we switch it off at 9, then the classroom heats up and the kids leave at recess, and we turn it back on again for 20 minutes and try and cool this class down, and we switch it off and switch it on at lunchtime. So when I went back to the department, I said, hey, look, anyway, they made some investigations. It's actually worse than that. They had to use it occasionally during class because it just got so hot. But the school actually went and bought the microphones for the teacher with the speakers in the class so the kids could hear above, the sound of the air conditioner. And because it's an evaporative air conditioner, it pumps condensation into the air. And for many of the Aboriginal students there, it inflames their otitis media, making their hearing even worse. So anybody who wants to go to a school and tell me a school like that and tell me they've got enough money or that a system's got enough money to deal with problems like that, it's just not true. So money matters. Money matters for lots of reasons. But of course, the biggest factor is teachers. And with our great teaching inspired learning reforms, this is probably where we've tried the most to turn the research that a lot of people in this room have done, a lot of the recommendations from the many reports written by people in this room, where we've tried to turn that into action. And it has been resisted by a number of vested interests, is probably the politest way of saying that. 3 Band 5s, if you're doing your HSC this year, you need 3 Band 5s, including a Band 5 in English to get into universities. The practicum now that students do whilst they're at university is going to be done in a much more structured way. We're going to move to a point where if you're a supervisor, teacher supervising, you will need to be essentially pre-qualified to supervise practicum. It won't be a matter of, in the staff room, whose turn is it to supervise a practicum and somebody puts their hand up because it's their turn. We want the best teachers in the school supervising students doing their practicum. There are 47 different recommendations, including additional funds for students who are in their first couple of years of teaching to support them in those critical years when we would otherwise sometimes lose a number of teachers because they're thrown into the deep end, giving them additional release time, giving release time for mentors to supervise them. So all of these changes to what happens in the classroom, because what happens in the classroom matters so much. And I'm going to give you a really bad example. But before I do that, those 3 things, resources, decision-making, teaching, all wrapped up in the power of leadership and the power of the people who lead them. Head teachers, deputies, executives in a school, and of course, school principals. School principals having the power and the authority to drive change in their schools. Like any organisation, the school principal or school leader is critical to cultural change within schools. I find, as Minister, the hardest thing now for me to accept is that I can't change personally what happens inside the classroom. I don't teach any children, the Secretary of the Department doesn't teach any children. To get change in schools involves people changing what they do inside the classroom. And Maury Mulheron is here from the union, who we consult with a lot. And sometimes I get criticised as a Conservative minister for consulting and working closely with the union. We don't agree on everything, right, Maury? We don't agree on everything. But we work together. They have 30, 40, 50, 100,000 members, I don't know. 60,000 members. And for the cultural change we seek in New South Wales, we require organisations like the Teachers Federation to be part of this relationship and to be part of this cultural change and to encourage their role in encouraging their own members to accept some of the changes, which are a challenge for some teachers, and to help us deliver that change message right throughout every classroom. But leadership matters. And leadership is not management. Leadership is not about making people that you're leading happy. That's management. Leadership is about more often than not, making very tough decisions. And we've got all the accountability measures in place for principals. But I'll give you that bad example. A friend of mine who's a head English teacher went to a new school, and he said that when it came time to do public speaking for the kids, I think in year 11 to do public speaking, they had to prepare their speeches, etc. And when it came time to actually deliver them, he was told that they didn't have to deliver them in front of the class. They only had to deliver them in front of the teacher, one-on-one, or if they were too shy to do that, they could deliver it to a camera and then just play the video to the teacher, and they would get a mark for. Now, he was utterly appalled by that. And when asked about why does this happen at this school, the answer was, because this is the way it's always happened at this school. Now, if you're talking about change in every classroom, change from every teacher who sees a practice like that, there's lots of fantastic practice out there, lots and lots and lots of fantastic practice that we all see. But there are some unacceptable practices, and that's an example of it. But it requires courageous leadership by a head teacher or by a principal to change that kind of practice. So we often talk about the good examples, but there are very average examples out there. And I'm going to almost finish on one other story, and this is my favourite. This is my favourite thing I've seen in 5 years. I went to a primary school in Western Sydney the other day, and first thing I noticed is we used to have 35 primary schools in Western and Southwestern Sydney that had barbed wire fences around them. So this is in places like Mount Druitt, Tregear, not East Marylands though, right, John? No. Hebersham Public. So, some of the toughest suburbs in Sydney, I think it was when they first built fences around school, they put up the chain mesh fence and then they put 3 or 4 strands of barbed wire across the top. So you go to a school in a pretty tough neighbourhood, and the school looks like, for some of those parents, some of the places they may have just come from. So one of the things I've done, a very minor thing that nobody virtually knows about, is we got rid of all of those fences and put at least those nice diplomat fences that you see at schools in the North Shore and the eastern suburbs. So we went to this school and it's got the nice diplomat fence now, so I was very pleased about that. Perceptions are everything. You were talking about students watching men read. I mean, what does it say to a child who walks into a school that's got barbed wire around its fence? Perceptions are significant and meaningful. Anyway, I went into the classroom and we were talking about Gonski funding, and this is a school that's received $300,000 or $400,000 in extra funding as a result of having signed up to Gonski. And we had a few parents in one of the kindergarten classes, and I was talking to one of the parents, and her son was being taught by a teacher's aide, and she told me the story how, so this was only a couple of weeks ago, how 18 months ago he couldn't even say a word. He was non-verbal, he's on the autism spectrum, non-verbal. He started saying individual words, and about 3 or 4 weeks ago he said his first sentence, and his mother was blown away by the first sentence. And then somebody was in hospital and she was away for the night, and her son sent her a little video of himself. And it was the first time he'd ever structured a sentence that he hadn't been taught. And the sentence was, "Hello, Mummy, I love you, good night." Now, she burst into tears telling me the story. And she burst into tears, obviously, when she saw that. But if you're talking about the power of education, the power to change people's lives, and she said his life will be changed because of the work that school's doing for him. But my life, her life, is going to be changed. Her husband's life, her other son's life is going to be changed as well. We talk about millions and billions of dollars and, tens of thousands of teachers and politics and parliament and leadership changes, all those kinds of things. But in education, this is what it means at a human, individual and human level. And that's why I do have the greatest job, certainly here in New South Wales. But I just want to end on this one question, that I'd like to think we've done a lot in New South Wales in 5 years, changed a lot of things. The best compliment I get is that I've been a principal for 30 years and it's the first time in my memory, my education life, that I've seen all of the stakeholders in education heading in the same direction. The government, the department, principal associations, the union, everybody's kind of heading in the same direction. Focusing on quality teaching, resourcing, needs-based funding, putting the money where it needs to go. My question is, why doesn't everybody do this? I was talking to Tony earlier about, lots of people talk about quality teaching. We've set minimum entry requirements here in New South Wales. We started with the exit credential, the literacy numeracy test that AITSL are now going to deliver nationally. There's 47 elements of that reform, some of it quite controversial, but why doesn't everybody do it? That's really the big question. So thank you very much to SVA for inviting me to participate tonight. It's been a great pleasure to be the Minister for Education for 4.5 years. In education in Australia, that's about 3 or 4 generations normally. But it is a great pleasure. And again, I'll just finish on this note again to thank all of those people who provide that research, provide that evidence, provide that data, all of those people who work in classrooms as teachers, as principal, as directors. I see Maria Seraphim, prolific tweeter over there. All of the people that are involved in education. It is a shared endeavour by everybody in this room. And when you see the consequences for that little kid in kindergarten, Freddie, we know that we're making a difference. Thank you very much.